get different perspectives on it, but let's get this party started.
It's funny when I talk to people at business schools, because I do a lot of informational interviews now, and they always ask me, when you were in business school in the late 90s, they say, oh, did sustainability, and I always say, there was no such thing.
It didn't.
When I went to business school, there was like one class that was called like international business, and that was basically it. So
Sure.
It's a new field of practice for sure.
Absolutely. So hi everyone, I'm Shane Snipes and you're watching Sustainable 1000. Of course, I'm traveling around the country doing 1,000 interviews across 48 states, although it will be 50 because I'm doing some radio programs in Hawaii and Alaska. And who knows, maybe they'll fly me up there. Or maybe not. Maybe I'll take a bike to Alaska and then a boat to Hawaii. But either way, I hope to reduce my carbon footprint a lot better soon because I'm focusing a lot more on webinars, as you guys know. It's a big thing of mine to try to get webinars to be more mainstream. Cisco is a great partner in that, and I appreciate them in that process. And this is, of course, I'm sitting down today talking with Justin Bakule.
Right.
Yeah. I've been pronouncing it completely different all day long because I do that to make myself remember it. So then you told me a different way, and I was like, dang, I should have spelled that phonetically somewhere.
Well, if you got it right the first time, you'd be the first person in my life. So consider yourself in the majority on that one. Right. Yes.
Justin Bakule is here, managing
director
at the organization FSG, and FSG is doing social responsibility and social enterprise consulting. They also work a lot with communities and getting them up to speed, work a lot with foundations as well, sort of getting them connected to communities. We'll talk about some of his work with the Knight Foundation and some of the other places that he's done work, because information exchange is one of the Knight Foundation's big things that it puts forward, and you guys help them with that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Justin, we were just chatting just a second ago, and I was talking about how sustainability wasn't really a thing in the 90s.
Right.
And sustainable development's been around a long time.
Sure.
Yeah. Sure. But sustainable development's always been seen as something for the developing countries.
Right.
How do you think there was a moment, a blink moment, or a moment when everything just kind of flipped?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And of course, I think it's a good question in the sense of, I come at it often from the corporate perspective. We work with a lot of corporate clients. And I think there has been a mindset shift that you've seen over the last 10 years. So if you look back historically, companies had corporate philanthropy programs, right? They were rooted in communities. They felt like it was important to play a role in those communities. And so they would do good things in the community, support the symphony, support local organizations, nonprofits, etc. And I think, ultimately what happened is there's a greater awareness in the world of the reach that corporations had in terms of the where they were touching society, right? And we realized that when you thought about Levi's or when you thought about Nike, that it wasn't just about the product that you found on the shelf at the finish line or wherever. Are they even still in business? I don't even know which one of those shoe retailers is still around. But they were, the ubiquitousness or the understanding of where these companies were actually touching, I think, became much more prevalent and well understood. So, issues of, say, for instance, exploited labor, sweatshop, that sort of thing. I don't think people really thought much about that if you rewind 10, 15 years ago. And I think that the trend that we've seen is that companies first came to the realization, wait, hold on, my operations and how I operate and how my business actually runs, there might be some societal problems. I might intersect with some problems. So I think the first orientation was, well, how do I mitigate those problems? How do I, manage around this from a reputation standpoint, right? That was sort of the first reaction.
And you still see that with some corporations.
You do.
They're still at that place.
Clearly. And that's why I think we like to talk a lot about being on a journey. Because with any of these things I think that I talk about today, we'll find folks who are leaders who are really, blazing a trail, as well as others who are still sort of stuck in old mindsets on some of these things. And there's always going to be this shifting of, what's the total package and who's doing what and how well are these different principles being adopted. I think the progressive companies started to realize, wait, hold on, there's a problem, and I can try to manage to the risk. But then the progressive ones started saying, well, wait, what can I do about the problem, right? And what are the things that I can invest in? And this was, I think, primarily when you started to hear the CSR, thinking come through, which was, how can I
corporate social responsibility.
Oh, thank you.
I'm the pop-up video there.
How can I think about something within my business where my business touches it, and how can I put resources against it. And so maybe that would be by leveraging volunteering and company assets that would volunteer in the community to help address issues of, community blight or things like that. But then what we started to realize is that companies, the progressive companies are starting to realize, how can I address the problem, right? So now there's a subtle shift there from acknowledging it and playing a role in it to how can I provide leadership there and how can I actually look to solve or address the problem. And I think that was another mindset shift in terms of companies actually owning problems and trying to solve them.
Right.
And then the latest article that we just published in HBR around creating shared value, and I'm sure we can talk more about that, was basically how can we then take that mindset and say, and how can these provide both benefit to business and benefit to society?
Right.
So what are the things, that are most, what I like to think about are the investments for companies that are going to be most durable are those ones that are closest to the business. So how can they take those ideas that are closest to the business and simultaneously address social issues? And we can talk about examples of that I think bring that concept to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have some excellent examples, not only that you've worked on yourself, but also that I read about in your article.
Yeah.
Creating shared value, CSV, as you put it,
right.
Which stands for something else, comma separated version for me as a techie, which is something important to Excel for all you.
I'll have to note that. I didn't know that. Okay, good to know that we're competing on CSV.
Yeah, so all the techies out there are like, comma separated version, that's interesting. But all the rest of the people who have no idea what I'm talking about, this is a new acronym for you. So from that perspective, I always look at shared values as something that I've always connected to. And I've always felt a sort of uncomfortableness about companies that don't acknowledge that there's a shared value in the community. And maybe that's why a lot of times, I'll go in and work with a company and ultimately I'll decide, when I was younger, I don't feel so good about that. And maybe it's because the shared value isn't as connected to the corporate culture. Do you think that there's a process or a place beyond CSV? Because we've moved from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to social responsibility, to sustainability, and now to CSV.
Right.
And there are some others too.
A little bit of talk soup in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question so the next level of progression is, do we always have to reframe the concept in order to get people to understand it?
And frankly, how do all of these work together? I think there's a lot of really interesting questions. What is it, if you're talking about CSV, what does it mean for a corporate foundation?
Yeah.
What does it mean for corporate philanthropy? What does it mean for the CSR folks, right? There's a lot of great, meaty questions that I want to acknowledge, as we've worked on the CSV paper. I think, we're even constantly searching with our clients, with our experiences, what's that next level down of how does this all work? How does this all connect? Well, let me try to answer your question by, talking a bit about an example that's in the article. Because I think part of the answer, the short answer is there something next? I feel like there's always a next, right? And the question is, how useful is the next? How much of a leap is the next going to be? And what shape is it going to take? But there's always a next, right? We got to, people who were practicing corporate philanthropy, 30 years ago probably thought that, that was all there was going to be. And except, you know what I mean? There's always some next and seeing where that goes. But if you think about the shared value example, I think the one thing that does make it, how should I say this, a bit more, hopefully, can be positioned in a way that can be more pervasive within corporations, is this intersection with the business. So let me provide an example from our client work, and that's referenced in the article, and to give you a sense of how closely intertwined this is with the business. So some of the work that we've done for the last few years has been in cocoa, which of course is, not everyone watching may know, but, basically comes from a band of plus and minus 10 degrees of the equator. So it's a tropical crop, typically grown in developing countries. And typically, in almost every country, it's grown by smallholders. So a couple of hectares or less of folks who grow cocoa as a cash crop. As you might guess, can't eat cocoa, as cocoa doesn't taste very good. So it's a clear exportable global commodity that consumer products companies and retailers, etc., rely on to make chocolate. And as it turns out,
one of my favorite things.
it's the one ingredient in chocolate that you can't substitute. So without cocoa, there's no chocolate, right? And every time you walk through Walmart or Target and try to pick up your favorite candy bar, you can't do that if there isn't cocoa. So the other thing that's interesting about the cocoa business is that the production of cocoa is highly concentrated in a small number of countries. So if you look at Cote d'Ivoire, 40% of the world's crop. If you add on Ghana, which is right next door, you're looking at another, I don't remember right off the top of my head, maybe another 15 to 20% of the crop. Basically, if you take Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Cameroon, 4 countries in West Africa, you're looking at 70% of the world's cocoa. And a third to 40% alone coming from the small, and for most people, relatively obscure country of Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, right? Not a country that the average person thinks about every day.
Sure.
So, think about our client, who's a consumer products company. Now, it's important to set a little context here because I think it'll point you towards how companies are changing. So they don't have any factories in Cote d'Ivoire. So there's none of what we would call fence line issues. So they don't feel a sense of responsibility because they have a physical presence there. There is no physical presence there. They're selling a branded product in the, global marketplace, that's chocolate. And so you might say, well, where would the lines of their responsibility be drawn? Well, I think the thing to reflect on is that cocoa is central to their business. As I said earlier, without that, they have no business. So it's in their interest, whether or not they have, an actual presence on the ground or not, to assure that the right quality and quantity, because it's both, it's quality and quantity, it can't be just volume, but it's how it's processed as well, comes to them. So when we talk about CSV, the motivation for their investment in smallholders in this case is because they have to have the product for their products.
Sure.
So sometimes people will say to me, they'll say, well, wait, hold on. Stop for a minute. You're talking about social investments with smallholders, sometimes at a loss, et cetera. Really like investments in a difficult situation. And obviously Cote d'Ivoire is going through a challenging geopolitical crisis at the moment. But people will stop me at that point and they'll say, well, wait, hold on. But that's in their business interest. That's right in the middle of their business to make those investments. And that's when I say, right, that's the whole point. There's an alignment of society's interests, which is the smallholders being more productive, more economically self-sufficient, able to invest and empower their communities, protect the environment, the biodiversity that's important in a tropic zone like that.
Sure.
And the company's interest. So there's a complete alignment there between what they both want, which is a better sort of agricultural production system that's healthier for people that live in those areas, allows them to be more economically self-sufficient, and benefits the company at the same time.
It seems like to me, we're still talking big picture, and I like that. And I want a little more clarification on something for our audience because they haven't necessarily read your article that came out in the Harvard Business Review. And that article, by the way, you can get it on fsg.org if you want to check it out right now while we're talking about it. But there's a question that popped into my head about the 3 parts of creating CSV.
Right.
And I'd love for you to just talk briefly about those 3 parts because that will put even more context to the example that you just gave.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. You're right, because my example is on one of the 3 parts. So the article basically argues that there's 3 ways to create shared value. One is around reconceiving products and markets. So folks reading the article, and it even references the work by C.K. Pralhad on the bottom of the pyramid sort of thinking. And there is some resonance and connection with bottom of the pyramid thinking. But it's basically that companies can identify opportunities to develop new markets. I think the Pralhad example sort of jumps to developing countries. But I think our article also sort of argues that there are examples even domestically in the United States, whether it's in the inner city, whether it's with the growth of minority communities and the specific products and market needs that they may have, and companies being more in tune as opposed to sort of a mass marketing approach of, kind of tailoring and how do they reach those different customer segments.
Sure.
So that's one. It's around how do you think about new products and services that address previously unserved communities or segments. Could be anywhere. The second component is around value chain investments. And this is really the example I was just telling you about quite clearly.
And everyone else talks about that, supply chain.
Supply chain,
yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Supply chain, value chain, and how do you basically make investments in your raw material supply to ensure, the supply that you need to run your business. The third is around what's called cluster theory, which is, and the article, for those of you who haven't seen it, was co-authored by Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School and Mark Kramer, who was one of our founders. And Porter, of course, in some of his previous strategy work, has talked about clusters, and so it sort of builds on that. The cluster approach you can connect actually to the Cote d'Ivoire example I was just talking about, in the sense that making the agronomic improvements. So if we're talking about cocoa farming in Cote d'Ivoire, how do I improve the provision of inputs like fertilizer, pest control products, plant stock, credit? So how do I improve inputs? How do I improve farmer education? And how do I improve post-harvest processing? Those are all the, that's all the agronomic part of it. But a cluster approach would say, but how do I also provide the other things, both in that community and in that region, that are needed to make it both A, more vibrant, and B, importantly, more competitive? So an example of that actually already exists in Cote d'Ivoire, which is that large multinationals like Cargill and ADM and Barry Callebaut, which is a French company, have production facilities there in Cote d'Ivoire. Mm-hmm. So notice you're going beyond just the the core function of farming the product, but you're starting on some actual processing, the export, so all of those things are providing jobs. They're providing additional ways that people can have an economic activity going on in those areas.
Sure.
In addition to all of that, part of the cluster would also consider what are the standard of living, the quality of living. So clearly provision of health, of education, of infrastructure that can make people's lives more enjoyable is all part of attracting a cluster. So a cluster could include things like education, and higher education, and those opportunities being available for people. Now, you can imagine in a place like rural Cote d'Ivoire, the state of those services and what's being provided now, and it's pretty basic.
Sure.
And that would come as no surprise to you or anyone listening.
And is it really the larger corporations? Are they finding a need to actually address some of those issues and start programs that directly deal with it, so they can have a higher, more highly educated workforce? Or have they actually begun that sort of work?
Yeah. So this
or are they just talking about it?
Yeah, I love this question, because this for me is a question that so clearly is where you enter the ecosystem of stakeholders that are involved with this, right? So clearly, we have multilateral and bilateral funders. We have the NGOs that operate on the ground. We have the government of Cote d'Ivoire, which clearly at this moment is an unsure thing. Who the government of Cote d'Ivoire? I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, or if you're
there's a lot.
If your viewers are, but there's a geopolitical crisis where basically an election, two men are claiming to be president. So clearly government there right now is a little bit of a loose term. So there's all these stakeholders. So the question, I love this question because it basically says, but what are the right roles for corporations? And by the way, everyone else that should be investing in this situation, like what should the corporation be doing? And again, our notion is that the corporation should be investing in those things which are closest to their assets and expertise. So what I would refer you to is that a lot of corporations would like to, for instance, set up a healthcare center. So now if my chocolate company says we want to promote and set up and support a healthcare center, I ask you, is that the best use of their finite resources in investing in that region? Or, could I convince you that the better use of that same dollar, if I have to talk about trade-offs between what I can do, is better used in investing things where they actually have assets and expertise? Well, what do I mean by that? I keep saying that phrase. So if they have R&D capabilities, so they're doing research into, cocoa science, isn't that a better use of their investment within that, in that particular area? Helping unlock, for instance, the ability of smallholders to access the inputs, using their influence to draw other corporations in to get committed to a shared vision of how change would occur in a place like this. Those are the things to me which are much better use of their investment. Now, here's the thing though, I'm not by any means suggesting that the other things are either A, going to magically happen, or B, that we should just figure somebody else is going to take care of them. So another thing I think in a situation like this is corporations are very well positioned to take a leadership role. And this actually, has a good relation to the article we published recently in the Stanford Social Innovation Review about collective impact. And we can talk about this. But I think corporations are well positioned, A, to invest in the places where they have the most expertise, But these big companies, the other big thing is throwing their weight and their influence and their leadership around to help mobilize the others who should be committed here. So getting the government committed to making investments in social sector pieces, if they don't have the ability to do that, to reaching out and connecting with the multilateral and bilateral donors to say, hey, there's, where there's a spark, there's fire here, and there's something happening here, and we're committed, and this is what we're committed to, and getting the other corporations committed. Like, I think that's where it starts to happen.
All right, and I hear you.
I'm probably giving you a lot of. I'm giving you a lot of fire here.
I totally hear you, and I hear what you're saying about all these things, and I just, I got a lot of questions from lots of different people on my list here, and they keep popping into my head, and things along the lines of you're sitting in a room, a boardroom, conference room, like we're in right now, surrounded by VPs and other folks whose main job is to make as much money as possible and spend as little as possible. Right. So
totally agree. Yes, totally agree.
In that mindset, where they've constantly and always looked at that bottom line, what's the aha moment for them? Where they see it. Do they have to see another corporation benefiting, like Eco-Imagination, and the fact that they're, I think it's 13 or 23% or something like that of their revenue is now coming from Eco-Imagination. For GE, for General Electric. So that's huge.
Sure.
Because that was just a little side project that everyone thought was a feel-good project, and I'm sure the rest of GE was like, what is this thing? And now they're seeing it over the next 15 years or 10 years to be the fastest growing area for their work, because they've been innovating and creating all these new technologies that people want to use now. So what's the sort of rubber hits the road in the conference room? What do you say to them?
Well, there's two things. One thing, let me recast the assumption around where this happens. So the people who are involved in this work, sure, they of course spend time in conference rooms, they spend time in airports, they spend time in meeting rooms, but they also spend time in Côte d'Ivoire. And so a lot of these conversations are happening at the end of a dusty dirt road in the most rural parts of Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana or wherever. So sure, the senior, executives, and are they bumping down the road to Côte d'Ivoire? Well, maybe every once in a while, right? But the people who are doing this work intimately understand the situation on the ground. So it is not at arm's length by any means. It's not a consultant that comes in with a couple nice slides that says, here's the data and this is why you should invest. Now, to your second question, which I think is an intriguing one, but wait, hold on. They just care about the bottom line. Here's the thing. Cocoa is the bottom line. This is very much the bottom line. So I can sort of relay to you, the situation when we were working on this project. And the business that we were working with was going through a strategy process where, clearly they were looking at a lot of different strategic concerns for the company. How do we, drive market share in these categories? All the things that you would think about and that your listeners would think about as like the core business issues. And ours was sitting there right next to all of them and needed to be prioritized at a certain level for this thing to keep going. And the basic realization at the executive level was the exposure our business has to a disruption of supply, that is the business. In fact, none of these other things matter if we don't get the right cocoa for us. So it is the business, and disentangling it from it is frankly impossible.
I think
does that make sense?
It does. It totally does. And I feel you. I think a lot of times what people do in situations where there are consultants in the room or where business people are in the room is they imagine there's this divorce between what social good a corporation should do. And by the way, the article, guys, FSG.org, go there, check out the article that they just got published in the Harvard Business Review about CSV, creating social value, which is really funny because I'll always remember that forever now. So CSV then is what we're talking about here, guys. And I'll take one of your Facebook questions because I saw one earlier and I just want to get you guys involved, make sure that you don't drop off. Melissa Cartier, thanks so much for sending your question over. What about the communities themselves? You talked briefly about that, but seemed to skim over it because is it too complicated for corporations to consider how their business could be improving communities,
Mm-hmm.
not just taking a resource out of it or
Mm-hmm.
creating a few jobs.
Clearly, clearly. Totally agree with the sentiment. So, a few things. The whole, and great question, and I probably did skim over it. It's one of those things where there's a lot of things you can skim over, and skimming over the people who are actually involved and actually growing the product is not a good thing to skim over.
Well, it's tough, right? Because we're still talking big picture. So thanks
Yeah,
for your question.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, but clearly, I mean, so that your viewers know. I mean, my orientation is, as we were talking about before we came on, was I have a Peace Corps background. I spent 2 years in Mali, and I'm with you. Nothing charges me up more rather than wearing the blue button down. I would rather be bumping down the road in Cote d'Ivoire myself.
Sure.
So the first orientation, of course, is always to be is to have your ear to the community and listening to the community. So a lot of the work that we do, and we sort of really bring this point of view to our work even past this particular project or this particular example, is really to get the root of where people are and talk to the people who this actually impacts.
Mm-hmm.
So first thing to take into account is engaging not only with farmers, right? Because farmers are one thing, but really engaging with the community more broadly and thinking about community needs, not only in terms of the agronomic needs, as I mentioned before, but the needs more broadly in the community. So is it education? Is it healthcare? Is it the provision of electricity and water and things like that? And really making that as part of the overall comprehensive package of what needs to be delivered to these folks is clearly a core component of what we're about. In terms of I'm trying to think of what was the second part of the question around I don't know if you still have it there, around the orientation of like getting a product from them. I'm trying to just go back to what that was.
Well, no, it was talking about.
Like
It
making
seems
them a
as
partner.
if corporations sometimes, especially if they don't have a factory there,
Right.
Their basic goal is to take that product out.
Right. Right.
Similar things happen in America.
Yeah.
And create food deserts in places like Nebraska,
Right.
where all their food is exported to them,
Right.
and then they get it back in a box
Right.
at a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
They have all this land to create all this food, and yet the variety of food they actually end up getting sometimes isn't that great.
Yeah.
So, from that perspective, I could see it be even more accentuated in a place like Africa,
Yeah.
Cote d'Ivoire, like you're talking about.
Yeah, so I think there's some interesting connections here actually to an environmental angle, which is that, clearly one of the thoughts, and this is sort of connected to what you're talking about. So we're talking about an exportable commodity that people can't eat. Typically a person who's farming this will have some part of their land devoted to foodstuffs for themselves because they're eating what they grow, right? But this is basically their source of cash. The challenge with cocoa is it's mostly harvested one time a year, income shop one time a year, and and then what do? You try to make it last all year, which is difficult for people to do. There is a second smaller sort of harvest. It's not quite that bad, but
yeah, they don't have a farm bill there, do they?
Yeah, no. We won't get into whether or not that's where they should head. But there's ideas around diversification too, right? Because when people got into cocoa historically, what did they do? There's a clear biodiversity implication here. So when you go to a cocoa field, it seems quite lush. It's red. Excuse me. It's extremely green. It has this beautiful canopy. You sort of go under the canopy. It's of course a tropical place, so it's very hot. You go under the canopy and it's very cool. And the trees are so thick that there's very little undergrowth. But what you realize when you start talking to people is that is a completely alien landscape to what it used to look like. And when you see parts of the virgin forest that haven't actually been cut down yet for cocoa farming, you realize, whoa, wait, hold on. Wait, what I've been looking at is not what this place used to look like.
Sure.
So, and as it turns out, from an agronomic standpoint, cocoa actually grows better in what's called in like a partially shaded system. So if it's actually intercropped with other species. And so you can take a diversification approach where you intercrop it with other species that can either A, provide other income, or B, can just help with the productivity of what you're actually trying to grow in terms of the cocoa. We'd like to intercrop it with things that are also beneficial in some way, and then improve the lifespan of the actual cocoa themselves. And then the sort of environmental angle from it is it gets you closer to what an original canopy would have been like, although it would not clearly kind of completely replicate that. And that original canopy has some biodiversity benefits, as well as, interestingly, and I alluded to before, to pest control, as people do in agriculture. But actually, it's sort of an intercropped, a better diversified system actually has a better mechanisms for pest control.
Sure.
Because it increases the biodiversity and increases the natural pest control, and hopefully reduces the reliance on, manufactured or chemical inputs that you'd need to put into a place like that.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of, well, there's a lot of those things in regular chocolate. If just like all the other food, if you're not eating organic and all the other things related to truly healthy, chemical-free
Right.
foods, chocolate, you're still having all those chemicals in your body.
Right.
So that's an important component of it, I think. Another thing for me, and I wanted to ask another question here,
Sure.
because I have tons of them. As I told you before, we have lots of questions coming in. All right, Aaron's question. I can't seem to quit chocolate. And you guys are now talking about chocolate and how much of a resource it really is for us to take advantage of and to utilize. Yet it seems to me sometimes corporations aren't looking at the big picture outside of their ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
How do you teach a manager
Mm-hmm.
to think outside the normal ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. So I guess it depends on on what manager you're sort of thinking about. Cocoa is only different in the sense that, people in the chocolate business, it is the one product. And when I talk to people about chocolate, I think what can be really eye-opening for people is anytime you eat it, basically anytime you eat it based on where it comes from, you're touching the developing world. And I think that always, for people that don't know much about it or about its origin, there's always this moment of like, really? Right. You're touching Papua New Guinea right now. You're touching Indonesia right now. And I think that there's a moment of, wow. So I think, people within, if the question is within sort of these consumer products businesses, these companies that are actually manufacturers of chocolate,
Sure.
I guarantee you, certainly within the business itself, within the, sort of commodity business, they're all intimately and I would almost argue painfully aware of, the source, not only of where it comes from, but the exposure that they have. And we talked a lot about Cote d'Ivoire, but, and from a business strategy angle, you might just say to yourself, why wouldn't you just buy it somewhere else, right? Why can't you just go somewhere else to get it if there's problems there? And it could be even in the spirit of this question of, well, if corporations cared so much, maybe the knee-jerk reaction would be, why don't I just get it somewhere that's safer? Mm-hmm. And the issue really boils down to, when you look at the major cocoa origins around the world, none of them are risk-free and none of them are without challenges to the actual productivity of what they're growing. And so aren't any easy answers. And the other challenging situation becomes is that cocoa is a tree crop. So even if I told you, today, because another thing people think is, well, can't we find another country where it's not grown yet? Let's forget for a moment about how the cutting and the amount of land that's needed to do that. But with a tree crop, if you're growing from the get-go, full productivity is basically like 7 years.
Once you plant it to
once
the
you
point
plant
where
it.
it's okay, where it's actually
right. And so what you're looking at Cote d'Ivoire is the world's #1 producer in cocoa. What you're looking at there is basically coming home to roost 30 years of investment. And basically in the 80s, the president at the time said to folks in the western part of the country that where there wasn't a whole lot of agricultural production, basically said as the national economic development strategy, we're going to be about cocoa. And we want to go produce that, make that into our cocoa growing region. But that didn't happen overnight, and is an amazing thing that a country like this, again, which I think so few people would give much thought to, is the producer. So I think the companies are very well aware of it. I don't think consumers are. I don't think your average consumer is well aware of the source of cocoa. And I even would hazard to guess that on cocoa brands that have the frog, or that have other marks like that, I don't think your average consumer, although it's got to be growing, but I don't think they really know what that means or the implications there.
No, I think they understand fair trade and they understand organic.
Right.
But they don't understand the actual origins.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what that means.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's a tough thing to communicate. And corporations are really good at communicating, so hopefully they'll get better at kind of showing the distance.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the actual cost of eating that chocolate, knowing that it's traveled so far?
That's right.
You know what I mean?
That's right.
It's taken a long time. It takes a long ways, a lot of effort and energy and resources to get here.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. A couple more questions.
Sure.
One I saw earlier from Jeffrey, and it was, What types of trainings
Mm-hmm.
really help people to understand this?
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the spirit of the question is trainings like within a company, or trainings within in the field or in a company? You think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like for the company that wants to move down this path,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know.
let me. That's a great pivot. Let me pivot away from the Cote d'Ivoire example and
Okay,
talk about CSV more broadly.
sure.
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that this thinking is new for companies. So let's reflect for a moment on, we talked, the first question was around the origins of this. And think about corporate philanthropy, think about, CSR groups. And for most companies, not all, but for most, the foundation is often off to the side of the business, right? And the benefit that a lot of corporate foundations have is that they tend to be actually, the boards of those often are the very senior executives of companies. But needless to say, oftentimes they're doing grant making off to the side and they're not integrated with the core functions of the business. Same with CSR. A lot of times the CSR folks are sort of like, oh, you're over in CSR, you must do those responsibility things. You make sure that we are organized against the United Way. You make sure that we're, have a good corporate volunteering program, et cetera. And they're not fully integrated into the business. So this approach, which says we should be thinking about opportunities that are core, that are central to the business, it is going to be new. And I think even in the conversations we've had since the articles come out, foundation folks are saying to us, so what does this mean for us? And CSR folks are saying, what does this mean for us? And I think the ones that I've talked to, at least in the last few weeks and last months, who see the transition are saying, how can we position ourselves well to influence how this goes in our company? Because we bring this social lens and this social understanding to these conversations. So we understand that angle into it. But the question is a good one, because this is going to be, sort of flexing new muscles for these guys, because they've thought, with the exception of the cocoa thing, which is nothing's a perfect example, but it's a very clean example because it's so core to the business. And there are many other examples which aren't so neatly packaged and core to the business. And when you say to me like, but the bottom line, I mean, that's so clear that like it is the bottom line. They're not all that easy. Right. So we definitely envision through this process of people learning about shared value, the training's going to have to be a big component of this. Yeah. So, we've designed, basically programs where we can go out and start to stretch the thinking and start to ask people, take some sample initiatives. Do you think that this is mostly about business value? Do you think this is mostly about shared value? Or do you think this is mostly about social value? Because typically companies will have some mix. And so how can we get companies to start thinking about what it really means? Yeah. And clearly for each industry, there are a lot of different implications. If you notice in this article, it doesn't really tease out, well, what does this mean for insurance? What does this mean for an oil and gas company? Sure. Or what does this mean for a consumer? I mean, so there's a lot of that thinking that needs to happen, and that training is going to be very important.
Well, that's why you set it up that way, because now everyone has all these questions, because then you're there to answer them, right?
But the good question, Shane, is have we already answered them, and we're getting them to ask us to answer them, or are we in a co-development process where we answer them with our clients and with people we know? And
I don't think that's the thing about a framework like this, and that's the thing about a framework like sustainability, which exists in a similar fashion. You don't have the answer until you go through the process of understanding what it means for you.
Right.
And that could be in one town versus another. And that town might only be 25 miles away from you.
Yeah.
But their version of sustainability is going to look very different.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this, in that way, and like I said, I love the framework and the lens from which you guys are talking, because it really does, it lends a new way to think about these things. Mm-hmm. And every time I get another layer of this, I'm like, okay, great. This is another piece of the puzzle that allows people. I always think of it as calculus. Mm-hmm. You have to constantly be analyzing it.
Right.
That's why people started getting MBAs so that they could understand these financial models and what was happening in all these dynamic and very complex financial systems, right?
And we learned in the financial crisis that nobody actually knew anyway, but that's...
Or they made things where they could do whatever they wanted to do, right?
Well, probably that too.
Yeah, that's true. So from that perspective, I'm excited to see it. And to wrap things up, because I know you have to get on with your day, and I appreciate you spending all this time with us.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure to have you and to get this kind of insight. I hope to have you on the radio sometime and follow up with some other discussions with other experts.
Yeah, I would love that.
At any rate, what do you think sustainability means? then, as someone who's talking about CSV a lot, and me, I'm a sustainability person, and I've been talking about this word and trying to understand it,
Yeah.
and now CSV is sort of like another layer of my understanding. And so for you, what's
Yeah.
sustainability mean?
Well, I think, in the case, if I can go back to the one that's closest to me in terms of Cote d'Ivoire, the orientation we had on that was clearly around a social, economic, and environmental. So I feel like that, core components of sort of triple bottom line were very close and central to our thinking. And I think, for me, you know, our orientation is around impact at this firm, and how can we get the greatest amount of social change. And so I feel like the in that mission led focus, it's like I probably have less interest and people might be wondering, well, how has the article been received? And clearly, there's been a lot of support, and Porter was at Davos talking with other, CEOs and things like that. But clearly, other people have said, well, what is new or what's different here? I mean, for me, and some people involved in CSR have said, we feel like, what you're describing is CSR, and do we need a new name? And, these things, the reactions that people have from an article like this that basically shoots like a broadside over people's, like people who have a certain frame and approach on things. And if you think sustainability, you might think, well, wait, does this mean sustainability goes away? I think what's a lot less interesting is to have those basically, debates about what to call it, and more is the things that are more important is what's at the core and what's the concept really trying to get across. I think the key concept here that's trying to get across is for companies to look at social issues as business opportunities. And I think sustainability can be this, it's inherent within that. And so, for me, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I don't see one replacing the other. And if, frankly, in my viewpoint, and the authors might disagree with me, if companies, want to call it CSR, but they have it central and core to the business, and it's about creating value for the business while addressing social issues, I think they would be fine with people calling it whatever they want.
Yeah,
And as
yeah.
we go on this journey, we know that people do call it whatever they want. And more than anything, I hope that what people reflect on is whether or not they agree with the premise. Do you agree with the premise that companies should hold the ability to address societal and business issues at the same time? Do you hold that as a true and possible statement, both A, because people do it now, but B, do you see the potential for companies who aren't doing it to get involved in it? And for me, that would be the magic, and that's the adoption, regardless of naming conventions.
Definitely, definitely. What a pleasure and a great definition. I feel like I'm sitting here with a brother because we both doing this great work. And Justin, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you and
Thank you,
explore
Shane.
some of these things with my audience. It's always a pleasure to have these kinds of mental explorations that show how the real world is really starting to shift.
Yeah, it's
You
been
know?
it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thanks for visiting us here in our office, and I'd love to be on the radio whenever that makes sense for your schedule. And best of luck
Absolutely.
with your ongoing. What number am I? 848.
847, 848. Yeah, we're around there.
That's a special number.
It
848.
is. It
Good.
totally is
Good.
a special number. They're also special, and I'm just it's been an honor. So guys, check out FSG.org. They have so many resources there for you, and many more coming. Because I was talking to the communications director, and I'm trying to get this guy over here to start blogging more, so that
I would add.
all of
I
that
would.
information
Yeah.
can come out.
No, I would add, Shane, that as a nonprofit, we are a 501c3. Part of our mission orientation is not just the consulting projects we do, which we do, but we do really are mission led. And I think that what relates to the comment you just made that's most tangible for your viewers is all of the intellectual capital we develop, all of the thought leadership that we do is all completely free on our website. So, if there's people on your site who are, interested in, work in communities, we haven't talked about all the areas we work in: global health, global development, environment, education. We've published on all these topics, as well as, nonprofits, how to engage with nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I love about us is that you can go there right this minute and get that all for free, and you can be the judge of whether or not, or what its worth is. But at least it's a source of information for people in the field on what we hope from our experiences are good practices and for people to think about.
Sure, absolutely. I can't wait to dive back into that article. I've read it twice so far. I want to read it again because I'm getting so much out of it.
Great.
It's actually helping me write some of the things that I want to write because you pull out these concepts that mean so much in so many different angles.
Great. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks again. All right, everyone. You've been watching Sustainable 1000, traveling around the country doing 1,000 interviews. Always a pleasure for you guys to be with me. Don't forget, contact me on Twitter and Facebook, all those places. You can find me at facebook.com/sustainable1000 and sustainable1000.com. Have a great day. Talk soon.